Picture this: October 12th, 1537. Hampton Court Palace buzzes with an energy that's been building for 28 long years. King Henry VIII paces the corridors, his massive frame trembling not with rage this time, but with anticipation. After decades of desperate searching for a male heir, after 2 failed marriages and countless disappointments, the moment has finally arrived. The cries of a newborn pierce the autumn air, and Henry's world transforms in an instant. His son, his precious, healthy son, has entered the world. Edward Tudor, the future king, takes his first breath as celebrations explode across London. Church bells ring, cannons fire, and the people dance in the streets. The king's 28-year quest is over. Just 3 days later, on October 15th, the infant receives a christening so magnificent it rivals a coronation. His half-sister Mary, despite being declared illegitimate years before, stands as his godmother, a moment of tender irony in this fractured royal family. 4-year-old Elizabeth, also technically illegitimate, carries the christening robe, though she's so tiny that attendants must carry her as well. But as quickly as joy arrives, tragedy follows. Queen Jane Seymour, Edward's mother, initially seems to recover from the difficult birth. The court breathes a collective sigh of relief. Then, 9 days after giving her husband his greatest gift, childbed fever claims her life. On October 24th, as little Edward sleeps peacefully in his crib, unaware that he's now motherless, Jane Seymour dies. Possibly from retained placental tissue, Henry plunges into grief, but it's brief. He has his heir, and that changes everything. For baby Edward, his mother's death means nothing. He has no memories to lose, no bond to mourn. Instead, he finds himself raised by a parade of devoted women who become his entire world until age 6. Margaret Bryan, who once cared for Elizabeth, now tends to this precious prince with the same dedication. Sybil Penn joins her, along with rockers whose sole job is keeping the royal cradle in gentle motion. Hans Holbein captures the 1-year-old Edward in a portrait that reveals a thriving child. Fair-haired, chubby-cheeked, dressed in clothing so exquisite it makes modern baby clothes look like rags. This is Henry's apple of his eye, his most precious jewel, as the king himself describes his son. In spring 1538, the people of Royston witnessed something remarkable. Their feared king, known for his terrible temper and brutal executions, playing tenderly with his toddler son. Henry lifts Edward high in his arms, showing him off through a palace window while both father and son laugh with pure joy. For these precious moments, Henry isn't the tyrant who beheaded wives and burned heretics. He's simply a father, delighted by his child. Those who care for Edward describe him as merry and marvelously pleasant. At Hunsdon, when minstrels play, the little prince dances with such enthusiasm he can barely stand still, full of what Margaret Bryan calls pretty toys, charming little quirks that make everyone smile. But even at this tender age, Edward shows the royal temper. When malaria strikes him at 4, he tells his doctor to go away when asked if he needs to vomit. He's already engaged to be married, to the infant Mary Queen of Scots, though this betrothal will soon collapse, leaving him free for future arrangements. After Henry's brief annulled marriage to Anne of Cleves and his tragic deadly union with Catherine Howard, a new stepmother enters Edward's life in July 1543. Catherine Parr becomes more than just another of Henry's wives. She becomes the closest thing to a real mother Edward will ever know. In the British Library today, you can still read the letters Edward wrote to Catherine, calling her his dearest mother, sometimes writing in Latin to show off his education. His handwriting is stiff and juvenile, but his affection is unmistakable. These letters reveal a boy hungry for maternal love, finding it finally in a woman who genuinely cares for him. Edward's education is already well underway, and his tutors quickly recognize his sharp mind. John Check, a former Cambridge professor of Greek, guides his classical studies. Roger Ascham, who also teaches Princess Elizabeth, helps develop his scholarly foundation. Anthony Cook rounds out this impressive team. Edward's diary, also preserved in the British Library, records how John Belmont teaches him French, another tutor he shares with Elizabeth. He studies scripture, philosophy, and liberal sciences, but most importantly, his teachers mold him into an ardent Protestant. Despite their complex family situation, Edward spends considerable time with his half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth. These aren't typical sibling relationships. They're bound by politics as much as blood, but genuine affection exists between them. Then, on January 28, 1547, everything changes. Henry VIII, the larger-than-life king who dominated Europe for nearly 40 years, dies. Edward, now 9 years old, records the moment in his diary with startling detachment, noting only that the Earl of Hertford brought him and Elizabeth to Enfield, where they learned of their father's death. Other accounts reveal more emotion. The two children cried and held each other as their world shifted forever. By January 31st, Edward is in London. By February 20th, he's being crowned in Westminster Abbey. But this coronation breaks with centuries of tradition. The service follows new Protestant rites, with an amended coronation oath and a sermon by Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, making clear that this king answers only to God, not to Pope or earthly authority. At 9, Edward can't actually rule anything. Henry's will established a minority council to govern until Edward comes of age, with no single person in overall control. But wills, even royal ones, can be ignored when ambitious men see opportunity. Edward Seymour, Lord Hertford, the same man who broke the news of Henry's death, quickly sweeps aside these careful arrangements. He becomes protector of the realm and governor of Edward's person, elevating himself to Duke of Somerset. The boy king now has a new father figure, his maternal uncle, controlling every aspect of his life. This power grab enrages Somerset's brother, Thomas Seymour, Baron Seymour of Sudeley and Lord High Admiral. Thomas feels cheated, denied the power and prestige he believes he deserves during his nephew's minority. His resentment sets him on a collision course with his brother, and ultimately with the headsman's axe. Thomas's first move seems romantic, but carries darker implications. He marries the Dowager Queen Catherine Parr, but only after Elizabeth rejects his overtures. It's a calculated move that infuriates Somerset, who sees it as an attempt to gain influence through the royal family. When Elizabeth comes to live with the newlyweds, Thomas's true nature emerges. He harasses and even assaults the teenage princess, sometimes with Catherine's disturbing knowledge. The situation grows increasingly dangerous until Catherine walks in on Thomas and Elizabeth in each other's arms. She immediately sends Elizabeth away, understanding finally what kind of man she's married. The story grows darker still, setting the stage for tragedy that will soon engulf this fractured family. Catherine Parr dies in childbirth in September 1548, and with her death, Thomas Seymour's restraints disappear completely. He immediately resurrects his plan to marry Elizabeth, but she rejects him again, perhaps understanding better now what such a marriage would mean. Meanwhile, Thomas plots against his brother Somerset, trying to undermine the protector's authority and win their nephew's affections. Since Somerset keeps Edward on a tight leash, Thomas takes a different approach. He slips the boy pocket money and notes, hoping to convince the king to reject Somerset as protector and choose Thomas instead. But Thomas's patience runs thin. One night, he arrives at the king's chambers to find the door locked. In his fury at being denied access to Edward, he shoots and kills the boy's pet dog when it barks at him. It's a moment that reveals his true character, a man whose ambition has no boundaries, whose violence emerges when thwarted. Somerset discovers his brother's schemes, and rumors spread that Thomas planned to kidnap Edward and force Elizabeth into marriage to secure his grip on power. The protector acts decisively. Thomas is arrested, found guilty of treason by act of attainder, and executed at the Tower on March 20th, 1549. Edward records his uncle's death in his diary with chilling brevity, noting only that the Lord Admiral of England was condemned and died in March. Such coldness in an 11-year-old raises questions that still puzzle historians. Was Edward simply unable to comprehend or intervene in adult politics? Or was he already showing signs of the ruthless calculation that would mark his later reign? Tell me what you think in the comments below, and let me know where in the world you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories from history's most fascinating figures. Edward's council pushes forward with Protestant Reformation, but their religious changes spark violent resistance. In the western counties, rebellions erupt in 1548 and 1549, first over the removal of religious images from churches, then over a new prayer book written in English rather than Latin. Somerset hesitates, unsure how to respond, and his indecision allows the revolts to fester until Lord Russell finally suppresses them in August 1549. But worse trouble brews in the east. On July 22nd, a group of rebels under Tanner Robert Kett occupies Norwich. Somerset's response reveals his weakness. He sends an insufficient force under William Parr, Marquess of Northampton, and when this fails spectacularly, John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, must lead a larger army to retake the city. The final battle is brutal. 2,000 rebels die, and Kett himself is captured, imprisoned in the Tower of London, and found guilty of treason in late November. On December 7th, he's executed by hanging from the walls of Norwich Castle, a grim reminder of what happens to those who challenge royal authority. The entire affair exposes Somerset's incompetence and destroys the nobility's confidence in his leadership. His simultaneous wars with Scotland and France have nearly bankrupted Edward's treasury, making his position even more precarious. Sensing danger, Somerset makes a desperate move on October 6, 1549. At 9 or 10 in the evening, he wakes 12-year-old Edward and rushes him from Hampton Court to the more secure Windsor Castle. Edward notes in his diary that watch and ward is kept every night, soldiers patrolling the walls, everyone expecting attack. But Edward isn't grateful for this protection. He's angry. He complains that he's ill and that his accommodations aren't suitable. His hostility, combined with overwhelming opposition from England's ruling elite, dooms Somerset's position. On October 11th, Somerset surrenders. 2 days later, his protectorate is dissolved and replaced by a council ruling for the king. Somerset finds himself imprisoned in the Tower of London on October 14th, confessing to 29 charges and stripped of his positions and much of his income. But in January 1550, he's released and pardoned, seemingly on his way to recovering royal favor and much of his power. He even dines with Edward in April, and there's talk he might regain his position as protector. This possibility terrifies John Dudley, now Duke of Northumberland and one of the major political powerhouses of Edward's reign. Whether Somerset actually plots to regain power, or Dudley simply fears he might, the result is the same. Somerset is arrested again on October 16th and sent back to the Tower on charges of treason. On December 1st, Somerset is found guilty of felony, though not treason, a crucial distinction that might save his life. But on January 22nd, 1552, Edward's uncle is beheaded at the Tower. Edward is now 14, old enough to intervene if he chooses, but he allows his uncle to die. Perhaps he genuinely dislikes Somerset for the chaos of his protectorate, or perhaps he's already showing the cold calculation that marks his approach to power. Edward also faces ongoing problems with his sister Mary. As a devoted Catholic, she refuses to stop practicing her religion and hearing Mass, despite the 1549 Act of Uniformity making such practices illegal. Her powerful cousin, Charles V of Spain, intervenes on her behalf, asking that she be exempted from the law. The request is refused, though Edward's council says she can hear Mass privately until the king comes of age. But Mary pushes these boundaries, allowing anyone who comes to her house to hear Mass, far from the privacy the council intended. In early 1550, she decides to flee England entirely, planning to escape on ships sent by Charles. The vessels arrive at the end of June, but at the last minute, Mary has second thoughts and stays. Edward grows increasingly frustrated with her continuing defiance and orders her to come to London in March 1551. The confrontation between Edward and Mary in March 1551 reveals the deep religious divide tearing apart their family. Brother and sister face each other in a tense standoff, with 14-year-old Edward berating his older sister for continuing to hear Mass. But Mary holds her ground with remarkable courage, refusing to abandon her faith despite the king's anger and the arrest of some of her chaplains. As heir to the throne and a wealthy landowner with powerful Spanish relatives, Mary possesses enough influence to resist her brother's demands. Edward can do little to stop her, so the official ban on her practicing Catholicism remains in place while she continues to ignore it. When she comes to court again in June 1552, the matter is tactfully overlooked, a temporary truce in their religious war. But Edward's time for such confrontations is running out. In February 1553, he falls ill with a cold that soon develops into what contemporaries call consumption, likely tuberculosis. In April, he writes that he's contracted measles and smallpox and is coughing up blood and bile. The signs are unmistakable. England's boy king is dying. Faced with his own mortality, Edward's mind turns to the succession, and what he contemplates horrifies him. According to his father's will, the crown passes to Mary, then to Elizabeth. But Edward cannot bear the thought of Catholic Mary undoing his Protestant Reformation and returning England to papal authority. He drafts a document known as his Device for the Succession, cutting both sisters out of the line of inheritance. Why does he remove Elizabeth, who shares his Protestant faith? First, he considers both sisters illegitimate. Henry had declared them so when abandoning their mothers, and though he restored them to the succession, he never re-legitimized them. Second, Edward fears Elizabeth might marry a foreigner, making England a satellite of a great European power, just as Mary would eventually do. Finally, Edward may suspect that Elizabeth would refuse to supersede Mary, recognizing her elder sister's stronger claim under their father's will. According to Henry's will, after Edward and his sisters comes their cousin, Frances Grey, Duchess of Suffolk and daughter of Mary Tudor, Queen of France. Frances has 3 daughters, the eldest being 15-year-old Lady Jane Grey. But Edward dislikes the idea of leaving his throne to any woman, so his initial plan grants the crown to the Lady Frances's heirs male, sons she doesn't have, then to Lady Jane's heirs male. To improve Jane's chances of producing those crucial male heirs, she's quickly married on May 21, 1553, to Guildford Dudley, son of the Duke of Northumberland. Guildford is brother to Robert Dudley, who will later become Elizabeth's favorite. But this marriage is purely political, a desperate attempt to secure Protestant succession. Within weeks, it becomes clear there's no time to wait for Jane to conceive and bear a son. Edward is dying, and his device must be altered. The phrase Lady Jane's heirs male becomes Lady Jane and her heirs male, making the 15-year-old girl his immediate successor. The legality of this document is incredibly tenuous. Edward's advisors tell him that only an Act of Parliament can override the 1544 Act of Succession, and that as a minor, he cannot legally make a will. But the dying king bullies many of them into accepting his device, using the last of his royal authority to force through this desperate plan. By now, Edward lies on his deathbed at Greenwich Palace, his young body consumed by disease. His final prayers focus not on his own soul, but on England's future. He begs God not to let the country succumb to Catholicism. The end comes on July 6, 1553. When physicians open his body, they find his lungs contained 2 great ulcers and were putrefied, strong evidence of tuberculosis. England's first Protestant king, just 15 years old, has fought his last battle. Edward is buried on August 8th in an unmarked grave in Westminster Abbey, a surprisingly modest end for a king who tried to reshape England's religious future. By then, his attempt to replace Mary with Lady Jane Grey has failed miserably. The 9-day Queen, as Jane becomes known, is already imprisoned in the Tower, her brief reign nothing more than a footnote to Edward's larger story. Looking back at Edward's short life, we see a complex figure who defies easy categorization. Was he simply a puppet, manipulated by ambitious adults who used his royal authority for their own ends? Or do we glimpse in his cold treatment of his Seymour uncles and his defiant sister Mary the makings of a tyrant, a boy who learned too early that power means the ability to destroy those who oppose you? His education shaped him into an ardent Protestant intellectual, but his experiences taught him that kingship meant making hard choices and accepting terrible consequences. At 11, he watched his Uncle Thomas die for treason without apparent emotion. At 14, he allowed his uncle Somerset to be executed despite having the power to intervene. At 15, he attempted to overthrow his father's will and centuries of succession law to prevent his Catholic sister from taking the throne. Perhaps the most striking thing about Edward is how quickly he learned to wield power without sentiment. His diary entries about his uncle's deaths are chillingly brief and matter-of-fact. His confrontation with Mary shows a teenager willing to use royal authority to force religious conformity. His device for the succession reveals a dying boy so committed to his Protestant vision that he was willing to destroy his own family's claim to preserve it. Edward's reign lasted just 6 years, but those years transformed England in ways that would echo through centuries. His Protestant Reformation survived his death and Mary's Catholic restoration, ultimately shaping the nation Elizabeth would rule. His willingness to challenge traditional succession laws prefigured the constitutional crises that would plague later Stuart kings. What do you think? Was Edward a mere puppet of ambitious adults, Or do you see in his actions the early signs of tyrannical tendencies? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to let me know where in the world you're watching from. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Edward's brief but consequential life, please subscribe for more stories from history's most fascinating figures. The tale of what happened next, Mary's fight for her throne and Jane Grey's tragic end, is equally compelling, and I'll be exploring those stories in upcoming videos. Until then, keep exploring the incredible true stories that shaped our world.